This is Geoffrey Beavers, and you will obey me. You will listen to the sirens of audio.
You had no right to tell them about the podcast. I was simply trying to prevent some boredom. What guarantee have you got that these audience members aren't going to review bomb us? Well, I had to take that risk. At least there's a chance they won't start cancelling us. Have you seen the audience yet? Have you spoken to them? I have subscribed them, and now I shall subscribe you. G'day audiophiles, this is the Sirens of Audio, the show that explores the universe of Doctor Who and other things too from time to time in the audio medium. My name's Dwayne, and unfortunately, Philip can't be with us tonight. He's let me know that he was unfortunately unable to make it, but we are joined by a guest tonight that's got some very interesting things that we're going to have a little explore into, and we're going to tie that into an audio story. We're going to look at Doctor Who and the Cave Monsters by Malcolm Hulke. The audiobook version read by Carolyn John. So we'll have a bit of a focus on that, but we'll also talk around Mac Hulke's career as well. Before I bring on my guest, I would like to just remind our listeners and viewers that we have some events coming up, live events in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne and Adelaide in September, where we have Katie Manning in Adelaide and Brisbane. Fraser Hines we have in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. If you head over to sirensofaudio.com, you can get the details for those events. If you can't make it to our September events, and I would recommend you do because they're all fun, but in November we have Sylvester McCoy joining us. So all the details for his dates in November are on sirensofaudio.com. You can check that out. And for two of the Sylvester dates, he is going to be joined in Melbourne and in Adelaide by Janet Fielding. So those in those cities are going to be very lucky. If we can get enough tickets sold in some of the other cities too, we might be able to persuade Janet to join us in Sydney or Brisbane. She was in Sydney last year and Brisbane, but some of those who are coming back to see Sylvester expressed a desire to see Janet once again, and it all depends on how many people come. We need to get some people to come and see them both. So sirensofaudio.com is where you will find out all that information. Now, let me bring out my guest. We are joined today by historian Michael Herbert. G'day, Michael.
Hi, Dwayne. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I do understand you're in the midst of writing a biography of Malcolm Hulke, so definitely going to delve into that. But tell us a bit about you. Where are you? And you consider yourself a historian. What are some of the other projects that you've been working on too?
Well, I live on the outskirts of Greater Manchester, surrounded by green hills. So I've been living in the north, or in Manchester, since I came out to university in 1973. Originally was living down in the south, but managed to escape home. Never went back. Became independent. Eventually learned to cook as well, painfully, slowly. So I've always been interested in history at school. One of my favourite subjects, and I studied at university. But then I kind of got a bit disillusioned, as you often do, when you study something fairly intensely for 3 years. But then in the late 70s, I became involved in sort of left-wing politics, fighting, well, this seems very topical again, fighting the far right. It was then the National Front. Now we're up against other people. And also rediscovered my love of history when I met two communists who ran their own working class library. And I became involved with that and started to research and write history myself. I did a book about a black boxer Len Johnson, who was discriminated against because of his colour, but also joined the Communist Party. And I've worked on books on the Irish in Manchester. I've done books on radical women in Manchester from the late 18th century through to the 20th century. And I'm currently, as you mentioned, working on a biography of Malcolm Hulke.
Excellent. Well, I'll get specific on Mac Hulke very shortly. But before we do that, I've told you what normally happens. And don't be worried when I raise my hands, because we're going to jump down the rabbit hole. Thanks, Michael. How was that experience for you? Jumping down the rabbit hole. All right. So I normally
Tom Baker falling into the pit.
Yeah, a bit like that. I normally put a question to Philip that he has had no forewarning of, and I have given you a little bit of forewarning. I didn't think I could throw you completely into the deep end like I love to do with Philip all the time. But because we're talking about Mac Hulke, and he seems to me, the little bits that I've read about him that you've written and others have written, he seemed to be a huge pioneer of writing, creating new shows, new ideas. And I guess I'm kind of bemoaning the fact a little that these days there doesn't seem to be too much new out there. There's a lot of remakes. There's a lot of samey kind of stuff. I don't feel like we've had a huge blockbuster or a new IP since the 80s. That's my personal opinion. You may know of something that I don't. But what's your opinion on that? Why don't we have all these pioneers of creativity coming out like Mac Hulke, building on his success and making something even bigger and better?
I think there's a kind of dearth of imagination and willingness to take risks in. As I can only speak really for British television, which I'm familiar with, obviously. I was part of that generation that grew up with TV. I was born in '55, when then we had just one channel, and then later that year we had two, and now we have hundreds. But there seems to be more creativity in the past because TV was new. And I think people were left alone to a certain extent in the BBC and on commercial television to just get on with what they were meant to be doing, which is making interesting TV that people wanted to watch. I mean, obviously, in terms of commercial television, you wanted the people to watch because you were standing advertising. But I think it was far less constricted by layers of bureaucracy. I think that's one thing. I mean, talking to Richard Bates, who worked on the Avengers, he was just left alone in the early '60s to make, 26 episodes of the Avengers a year, and nobody felt they needed to interfere. And he worked with the story editor and the director to create interesting, clever, idiosyncratic television. And the same, I suppose, went to Doctor Who. That they were left to get on with it. I mean, there were occasional controversies in the '80s, but by and large, people were left to get on with doing what they were meant to be doing and what they were good at. Whereas now it seems that there's far less willingness to take risks or try something new. Also, as you said, there is often retreads. Also, we're stuck with endless formats. So British television, there's endless police series, detective series, edgy series, which usually seem to involve the murder of women, which is depressing. So I think we've also lost the single television drama. So, for instance, Sidney Newman, who played quite a big role in Malcolm Holt's career, was brought over from Canada initially to work on creating armchair theatre, where every Sunday there was a new play. So you can imagine how much work that was. But also you needed lots of writers, and they explored all sorts of topics. Sometimes quite small topics. Sometimes they did topics like racism or unemployment or alcoholism. Every week there was a play exploring social issues. And the same went for other series. British BBC had lots of single dramas, where the Wednesday play in the '60s, Play for Today in the '70s. So again, exploring topics of interest to people. And we've lost that, so we're now stuck with endless, repetitive series.
Interesting you mentioned Richard Bates, because I know that name from a TV series that I loved as a kid, which was The Tripods, which was adapted from a series of books. So not completely original. So adaptations, do they factor in as well? Because there's endless movies out there that are adapted from books and novels. but not so much original stuff, particularly from the big corporate studios out there. I think you're absolutely right. They're not willing to take the same risks that they used to, or are they not willing to take the same risks on the creators that they used to? They want to have all that control on everything.
I think things are put through endless focus groups beforehand.
Yeah.
So if it offends 2 people out of 100, it feels like, oh, we better pull this or change it. So I think there's less, also the willingness to sometimes challenge the public. There's a lot of controversy in the 60s on some of the programs that were put out. I think Wednesday Play. Yeah, Cathy Come Home, which dealt with homelessness, had a huge impact. I mean, this is again because TV, there was only 2 channels, so a television play or drama would have a huge impact, which we've lost now because there's so many channels. So it's rare for programs to have a big impact. There was quite a big impact this year, a drama series about the mistreatment by the post office of sub-postmasters. Some were accused of thefts and were prosecuted and some jailed. And although
Was that Mr. Bates versus the post office?
That's correct, yeah. So although there's been a lot of journalism by Nick Wallace and others, a lot of radio programs about it, and 1 or 2 TV documentaries, the drama brought it into people's living room, and it had a huge impact and forced the government to bring forth legislation which has exonerated them all, which is a very unique occurrence in British legal history. So TV can still have an impact, but by and large, actually thinking about it, when I was growing up in the 70s, when we all watched the pop music program Top of the Pops on Thursday evenings, I think it was, one appearance on that would have a huge impact. I mean, when like David Bowie appeared and did Starman, everyone was going, "Who the hell was that?" And so you become famous overnight sometimes. Again, we've lost that, I think.
Is that part of the problem as well? There's just too much content out there that maybe the good stuff is there. You've just got to look a lot harder to find that. I always find that with music too. I like certain styles of music, and they're sort of much more underground now, because the 70s is my favorite decade musically, but there's lots of 70s style music out there, but you've really got to look hard to find it. And maybe that's similar with TV. There are occasional good TV shows out there, just not as many as there used to appear to be. And that's possibly because there's just so much more of everything else.
We've been watching an American series, Portlandia. I don't know if you come across that, but it's very funny. No. It's set in a kind of...
Okay.
It's the 2, Fred Armisen and Carrie Brownstein, who is a rock musician, but they sort of play endless characters in a kind of fictitious version of Portland, but it's kind of close to home. It's very funny and very clever, which I recommend to yourself and your viewers and listeners.
Very good.
Community, an American series called Community, set in a small college in a small town, which is very funny as well. So you have to kind of look for the pearls.
Yeah, absolutely. Remakes as well, that's another one, because they've remade in America lots of television programs. I still haven't been able to bring myself to watch the remake of Magnum PI, because I don't think anything can beat the original. Same with Hawaii Five-0, they've done that. The one remake that was extremely successful to me personally, that I could separate from the original, was Battlestar Galactica. I thought they did that really, really well. That was an example of a remake that was done well. Did you get a chance to see that?
No, I've watched very little American science fiction series.
Yeah,
never quite.
Well, I'll recommend that to you. First of all, have a look at the original 2 series from 1978, 79, and then the remake, which is fascinating take, which I think was done really well. It doesn't always happen. I think it's rarer than common.
I'm still working my way through.
I'm
still working my way through Space 1999 at the moment, so I'm trying to catch.
And yeah, please don't get the ideas studios to remake that. It's just perfect as it is. Let's leave it there. It's great. All right, let's jump up out of the rabbit hole. And before we chat further in depth on Malcolm Hulke and all things surrounding him, I'll play a bit of a clip from Doctor Who and the Cave Monsters, read by Carolyn John.
On the ground above each shelter was a device to detect the return of the Earth's atmosphere. Once everything was back to normal, these devices would automatically trigger huge amounts of electricity to wake up the sleeping reptile people. Cato said,
"Are all the animals safe?"
it had been decided to take a male and female of all the more useful reptile animals.
"What?
Said Octel, lost in thought.
Our animals?
Said Cato.
Are they in the shelter?" "They went down first,"
said Octel.
"I made sure of that."
He paused.
"A pity we're taking none of the little furry animals." "You are a strange man,"
said Cato.
"The little furry animals are dirty. Insects live in their fur. In any case, this event will rid our planet of the mammal vermin. When the little planet draws away our atmosphere, even only for a few minutes, all creatures on the surface will suffocate and die."
Morka came up beside them.
"Octel keeps one of the furry animals as a pet. Is that not true, Octel?" "It amuses me." "Your pet will have to die with the others. We shall be better off without them. They raid our crops,"
said Cato.
"Our farmers will be glad to see the end of them. But I am sorry about your pets, Octel." "You only say that because Octel is the leader of this shelter group,"
said Morka.
"The little furry animals revolt me. They grunt, they have families, and they are fond of each other. It is that quality which makes them interesting,"
said Octel.
"In the zoo I've noticed how they touch each other and put their limbs round each other's necks. Yes, and press their lips to each other's faces. It's disgusting."
Octel turned to Cato.
"But as a man of science, do you not find it interesting that a species exists so different from ourselves?" "Interesting,"
said Cato.
"but I do not care to be near them. They also smell." "Very true. Shall we go into the shelter?" "I shall follow shortly,"
said Octel.
All right. Before we get into Malcolm Hulke, Michael, tell us a bit about your Doctor Who fandom. Are you a fan of Doctor Who?
Yes, I am. Yes, I've been watching it since I was 8, 8 and a bit. So I watched the first episode in 1963 on An Unearthly Child, which I'm sure.
So you have memories of that?
Yes, I do. Yes, yeah, I was old enough to remember it, and then I became hooked on it. So I watched it continuously from then on. Really, every Saturday evening at 5:15 after the football and before or after the grandstand, which was a kind of sports program, and before Jukebox Jury, which was a sort of pop program where minor celebrities from the pop world came on and judged the latest discs. So it really kind of captured my imagination, I think, as a child, because it was completely different to anything else that was on TV, really, both the sort of the music and what happened. So I became very familiar with the series and followed it through the various Doctors into from the 60s into the 70s.
So what's that magic element of Doctor Who, do you think, that captures the children your age, that keeps you watching for decades to come?
Yeah, I think it was just because it was very different. I mean, also you had new stories every 3 or 4 weeks. So if you didn't like one, there was always another one coming along. I mean, it was on all the time, Dwayne. It was one of the things that people perhaps younger don't understand, that it was on like 48 weeks a year or so. The strain on the actors must have been colossal, doing basically one episode a week. So I think they started on Monday, rehearsed it in some dust-ridden church hall somewhere. And then they kind of worked out the positions, and then they rehearsed it with cameras, and then on a Friday evening it was shot in about an hour, and then you start all over again with a new, the next script. So the strain on the actors must have been enormous. It's not surprising Bill Hartnell was burned out after 3 years. So you always had it was on all the time, so it was always available to watch. No repeats, of course. That's what we're privileged to enjoy now. We can pick over it endlessly. But then it was just on. If you missed an episode, that was it. So I always tried to make sure I was there to watch them on a Saturday. And then I read some of the books, the 3 novels that came out in the 60s. I read those, got from my local library. So yeah, I always enjoyed it. I didn't know much about the show in terms of its making because I was young. You just watch it and enjoy it, or not enjoy it. And I enjoy the history ones as much as the science fiction ones. There's a bit of a myth around them that they weren't popular, but I don't think that's true actually. So I got
they're still
interested.
popular. They're still popular in fans of that era. Like they're probably my favourite stories, the historical ones.
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to watch Marco Polo and the Massacre.
Rub it in.
Yeah, you can work out a way of downloading my generation's brains, and then we could get them back. But I think they're lost forever now. But I enjoyed the audios of them. I enjoyed it when it came back in 2005. So then I got kind of interested in the history of the show. I started reading Doctor Who magazine, which I didn't know anything about until then. And then I became interested in Malcolm Hulke. I came across the fact that he'd been in the Communist Party. And then I came across in a library in Salford, the one I mentioned earlier. They had a copy of a pamphlet he wrote in the late 50s when he was involved in Unity Theatre, which was a socialist theatre company in London. And he'd been involved with that. And he wrote a kind of guide to what Unity was all about for new members, explaining the various jobs and how it worked. So I thought, well, this is interesting. I'll try and find out a bit more about him. It didn't succeed hugely. I not enough to write a small pamphlet that 5 Leave Books in Nottingham were kind enough to publish in 2015, I think it was. And I left it aside. But then with the pandemic came, we were all at home. I thought I'll have another go, and had access to newspaper archives. And then I started to make contact with people who'd actually known him, which was very helpful. His nephew, he had a landlady, Betty, and her daughter, Jean, is still around, and she was very friendly with Mac. And she had lots of letters that he'd written to her. So there was all sorts of bits of information came together. And they made contact with a few more people, including Richard Bates, who worked on the Avengers with Mac. So now Telos, the Doctor Who publisher, are interested in publishing it next year. So I've already finished work on it. And I think I've got just about as much about him as is possible. Sadly, he died a long time ago, and many of his contemporaries have gone as well. So there's enough, I think, there to make it.
But it was that initial fact that he was a communist that was your connection.
Yeah, but sort of there's been sort of overt politics. I think you don't really. Most, not all writers tend to be more progressive, more liberal. But Communist Party in Britain wasn't huge. It was quite influential at certain points, in the 30s. Had quite a few members in the 50s until sort of the 56. And the Hungarian uprising, and also the Khrushchev secret speech, etc. So there were various splits in the party. It did have quite an intellectual wing, and was interested to a certain extent in culture and arts.
So have you settled on a name for the book yet? And you said it's coming out on Telos Publishing next year sometime.
It's called Don't Believe Everything You See, which is a quote from the Faceless Ones, I think. Something. So a lot of Malcolm's work is about sort of the things you're seeing aren't necessarily true, or there's a lot of deception, illusion in both his work for television and in Doctor Who and other series as well.
So are Telos going to put up pre-orders for it? It's got a set release date, or are you?
No, not yet. No, I need to get a final edit it, and then probably towards the end of 2025. So don't rush to the bookshops yet, folks.
Gotcha. No, we'll definitely look forward to that because he's a very important character in Doctor Who, that's for sure. But I think it's funny, this story as to how Mac, I'll call him Mac because it's shorter, and that's what everyone else called him, how he got into writing in the first place.
Yes, but I think you've had a kind of complicated and an interesting story. He was born in 1924. His mother moved around a lot because she was always escaping debtors and creditors. So he didn't really go to school very much. And he actually wrote an article, a broadcast in the 60s about I never went to school, which I got hold of, which is sort of fascinating detail about growing up and always moving and Spent most of his time with adults rather than other children. But he seemed to want to become a writer quite early on. So in the sort of 30s, when he was about 14 or 15, he started a little family bulletin and used to circulate that around his relatives. And so he seemed to want to aspire to be a writer. And also I got a couple of his letters written during the war, which are kind of very interesting, very literate, quite funny in a dry way. So he certainly had style and knew how to write very early on. But he really got into writing, I think, around about 1955. He kind of met up with Eric Pace, who was also aspiring to be a writer. And they started sort of working together, both been involved in Unity Theatre as well. And so they eventually managed to get a play on the BBC in 1958. So there's a big, as I said, there's an increasing demand for drama. And then they worked for the commercial television, got to know Sidney Newman, and did work for Armchair Theatre. And then they wrote a series.
Didn't he see something or read something that was so bad that he thought to himself, well, if that can get published, or was it a TV show or a book that?
No, it was yeah, that's right. He wrote what you would now call a pulp fiction book. He was on a bus.
Yep.
He picked up this terrible pulp, sort of lurid, sort of semi sort of suggestive kind of book that those people published a lot of. They've all got these kind of classic kind of pulp fiction titles like Dead Dames Don't Squeal or whatever, things like that. And so he sort of contacted the publisher and wrote this terrible book, which I've not been able to get a hold of, unfortunately. So he thought, well, if they can do it, so can I. And he actually got paid as well. I mean, that's another attraction for writing is people will pay you. So he wasn't very keen on the jobs he was doing. He was sort of a bit fed up. So he discovered that he could write. And so he worked with Eric Pace. I said, then he did Pathfinders in Space, which is a 4 series of children's science fiction in the early 60s, from about 60 to 61 to 62. Which in some sense is a bit of a forerunner to Doctor Who. Again, connected with Sidney Newman, who was quite keen on science fiction. So it's about a British rocket research group who send the rockets first into space, then to the moon, then to Mars, and then to Venus, all shot in a studio in Birmingham. So it proved very popular at the time. It's a kind of mixture of adventure and science, so you can see where, in some sense, it's a kind of forerunner for Doctor Who, I think, really.
So this came out just after Quatermass, didn't it? So Quatermass was
I think the last Quatermass was Quatermass and the.
So this was like
57, 58.
This was Quatermass for the younger audience.
Yes. Well, Quatermass was on BBC, of course, whereas this is on commercial television.
Yeah.
It's an interesting series. The last 3 series have survived and worth a watch if you're interested in how television was made. Again, rehearsed during the week and then shot in one evening on a Friday, and then everyone goes to the pub. Involved young people, so there were like teenagers in it to go into space, so you can see the attraction for a younger audience, to identify with these teenagers going into space and having adventures, and a hamster. The hamster goes with them too.
I did see the hamster.
Yeah, actually,
I noticed that Michael Craze was cast in the original one that's now missing. So there's a slight Doctor Who connection there.
Yeah,
but he was recast for the rest of them apparently. So
yeah, they changed the whole cast more or less. Brought in Gerald Flood as a sort of one of the main characters, as a kind of journalist who then gets to go into space as well. So he's quite a charismatic and sort of a good-looking actor. So they obviously thought, well, he's more interesting than the rather stuffy professor who'd gone into space before. And of course, there's a connection
So why did Mac sort of write with a partner quite often? Did he write much on his own, or was it usually with a partner?
He did work with a number of other people. I mean, he worked with Terrance Dicks in the early 60s on 4 episodes of the Avengers series. So I think it's quite a lonely life as a writer, just sitting there with your typewriter. So you can see why people might want to also sparking ideas off each other, because then you've got
that collaboration come about with Terrance?
Malcolm Mack owned a house. He was living with Betty Tate as a lodger, but he also bought a house round the corner in Hampstead, again, to bring in income. He's always quite keen to earn money, I think, Mac, understandably, because who else is going to pay you? So he bought this house and rented it out, and Terence was one of the lodgers, and they got chatting. And Terence was then working in advertising. He thought that Mac was the handyman. Well, he was, but also discovered that Mac was a writer. So Mac invited him to work on the Avengers with him. So they worked out of the 9 episodes that Mac did for the Avengers. Terence wrote 4 in the early 60s. I just watched one of them last
Was
night.
that for series 3 with Honor Blackman?
Yes, it was the Honor Blackman years that most of Mac and Terence's episodes. They're kind of interesting series. Also, like I said, they often have these element of illusion and deception. And so, what I watched last night, The Mauritius Penny, which is partly set in the world of stamp collecting, that's also a cover for a fascist attempt at a coup.
Okay.
And in other of these episodes, like this one set in horse riding stables, which is a cover for a kind of well-paid assassination bureau. So, as I said, don't believe everything you see.
It's a fascinating series, The Avengers, because series 1's different to everything else, and then you would if you watch the first sort of 3 series, by the time you get to the last series, you would think it was a completely different show altogether.
Yeah,
It was a show that evolved quite a lot. It was
very much
fascinating.
so. Yeah. So the first series, the main sort of lead was Ian Hendry, quite a well-known sort of rising young actor of that period, and then he decided to leave, and then Patrick Macnee became the main lead in it, and then he had these women companions, of which Honor Blackman, who was written in a very different way, because she evolves very quickly from a sort of fairly ordinary, sort of usual conventional companion to very fierce woman who fights judo or karate or uses weapons. So she's quite fearless. Also quite antagonistic. They have quite an interesting relationship. So she's not the kind of meek and mild companion. She's often quite irritated by Steed. So their relationship is often her being quite irritated and quite annoyed by him. So there's a lot of tension and conflict. I think Max said something like in drama you're always looking for conflict. So here you've got conflict between the 2 leads, which is kind of irritated or annoyed by him. And you can see that in some of his Doctor Who series. There isn't conflict just between the sort of the aliens and the humans. There's also within the aliens and the humans often conflict, like the Silurians that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we mentioned Pathfinders, which was produced by Sidney Newman. Why did it take so long for Mac to actually get something into TV Doctor Who? Why not with Sidney? What was the story there? I know he submitted a few ideas that never got made.
Yeah, well, Sidney Newman was originally working for commercial television, and then basically was poached by the BBC to become head of drama, and he starts work in January '63, and so he kind of reorganises how drama works. So he gets rid of the script unit where the BBC had kind of in-house a script unit churning out scripts, and instead gives the lead to producers to recruit their own script writers, with a story editor or script editor to kind of knock them into shape if necessary. And so quite early on, when in the spring of '63, when Doctor Who was being sort of devised by him and Donald Wilson, I think Nick Newman suggested to David Whittaker that he should contact Mac and sort of invite him to submit some ideas, which duly happened. They came up with 2 ideas which were pursued and were quite a long way to being realised. One was set in sort of the Roman Britain around about 408, 410 AD, as the Romans are departing. And the other one was set on a sort of alternative Earth, the hidden planet. So they were proceeding with the one was kind of penciled in to the first series of Doctor Who, but then it was kind of pushed aside. So they were constantly re-evaluating as they went through because of Doctor Who was going out every week. And then when the Daleks came along in the second serial, that kind of changed how they approached. They suddenly realised that the aliens and the monsters in Doctor Who was going to be very popular. So they spend a lot of time after the Daleks. Well, they bring them back very quickly in the Dalek invasion of Earth. Having killed the Daleks off at the end of the first Dalek serial, they quickly bring them back in a slightly opaque way. And then they're always looking for a sort of new Daleks, aren't they? So they try out various mechanical, like the mechanoids and the quarks. The Cybermen were a big hit, so they keep bringing them back. So, initially,
You'll have to forgive me because I'm looking over here at I'm speaking to a historian, but I'm looking at Wikipedia, and that fountain of almost true knowledge.
yeah, mostly occasionally true.
Yeah, that's it. So yeah, The Hidden Planet. It says it was originally a 6-part story. David Whittaker let it go. It was resubmitted as a 5-part story, and Dennis Spooner rejected it as well, apparently.
Yeah, Mac's always like never let anything slide. If you've done work, you can always like try again. So
try and get it in again.
Yeah, so
and then he submitted a couple of things with David Ellis. So, what was the connection with him and David?
Yeah, so they real name was David Kirkham, I think, but he wrote under David Ellis. I'm not quite sure why. Well, they met at a meeting of the Writers Guild, which was a trade union for writers that Mac helped set up in the late 50s with Ted Willis and David Whittaker, Eric Pace, and a number of others. And the idea was that they wanted the writers to be paid properly because a huge amount of money was being made, particularly on commercial television, out of the advertising. And they thought that the writers should get a bigger share of it. So but they had Ted Willis on board, who was a very big figure in television in the 50s and quite hard fact, and another former communist. So they negotiated good deals with both BBC about getting paid up. Also, being paid up front, getting half your fee up front and half when you finish. So they decided to work together. I think they both worked on a series called United, which was a kind of football series for the BBC, and they knew Jerry Davies through that. Jerry was now the producer. So they submitted some ideas. So initially they came up with a thing set in a big department store, and they sort of submitted this, and then Jerry came back to them and said, actually, can you change that and stick it in an airport instead? So they did. So that turned into the Faceless ones. So but that was
it says here there was a story an idea that they submitted before that called The People Who Couldn't Remember.
Yeah,
have you ever come across that?
Yeah, it's a band. I'm not able to get hold of any detail on it, so it seemed to be like a variation on some of the previous. So Mac's always recycling ideas and trying them out again in a different way, I think. But so the Faceless ones, after a lot of rewriting, went out. I think it's a very interesting series, again about deception, isn't it? The Doctor says, "Don't believe everything you see," or things aren't necessarily what they seem, Jamie. So he's very clear that, again, obviously a bit of an obvious giveaway, isn't it? The chameleons, people who can change. So it's about this kind of the Chameleon Airways being a cover for an invasion of the Earth by the chameleons who've lost their own identity, assuming human identities, and kidnapping little young people and shrinking them down and sticking them on a satellite, which the airplanes could fly up to. So it's full of interesting ideas, I think, and realised quite well, I think, given the technology at the time.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, Big Finish have done a series of lost stories by stories similar to this that were pitched and never gone through. Do you know if that's ever been thought of with Big Finish? Have you heard anything? Are there any scripts available, or even synopsis or treatments?
I think you would need a sort of outline, the detailed outline, and I don't think any of that survived. Whether they just sent it back when they rejected the ideas, and unfortunately, all of Mac's own paperwork vanished after he died. So there's nothing there to really, other than what's available. I think there's a couple of letters about it, but beyond that, there's nothing you could really build a script around, I don't think. So I don't think it'll ever get made, sadly.
You've touched on it briefly, but what was his view on putting politics into his writing, his stories?
Well, he did say something about how when in his Avengers stories, the bad guys are always capitalists, but he says nobody noticed. So he did have a sort of, he did have a world view from the left, but he didn't sort of ram politics down people's throats. So it's generally about creating interesting storylines. He wanted to create stories that interested people and would catch people's attention, and were well-rounded stories. So in terms of his Doctor Who books, they are different to the broadcast series because television and the novels are different medium. So he wanted. That's why his books add a lot more detail, a lot of backstory. But it was political, but with a small p. And I think Barry Letts in an interview on the DVD release of the War Games, they talk about Mac a bit. They said we always had a kind of message, but we didn't mind that. But it wasn't like sort of political propaganda. It wasn't a kind of agitprop thing. And also, a lot of his work, the bad guys aren't purely, they have the aliens in the faceless ones do have some, you might not agree with what they're doing, but they want to have somewhere of their own, or they want a planet of their own. They often write, complex monsters, complex aliens. They're not black and white in either of the humans. It's not like bad versus good, except in the War Games. That is very one-sided. But in his other work in the 70s, they're much more complex.
However, all the characters in the War Games are very complex. I can watch that and it feels like a 4-part story to me. Where some 4-parters in that era feel like 12-parters to me.
Yeah.
But the War Games is never ever like that. So was it sort of 50-50 collaboration with Terrance Dicks on that, or was it more swayed one way or the other?
I think they just wrote together. People asked him that. He said, "Well, you can sort of say that both of us wrote 100%." He said. In other words, it does say, the quote, that the best when you're writing together, the first thing you should do is forget who wrote what and who came up with what, because otherwise you won't get to work together. So it's just seen as whoever. Yeah. So again, it's about sparking ideas off each other and then back. Malk was a very good typewriter, by the way. Apparently, he could write like a machine gun. Somebody said. So presumably they'll throw around some ideas. Okay, let's do this. Right, Mac will type it down. Right, now what do we do? So I think that's how they work together. They got on very well. I've spoken to Elsa, Terrance's widow, and she has some nice memories of Mac because they live very close, around the corner from each other. So in Hampstead, in houses now worth millions. But in those days, Hampstead wasn't quite such a well-off area. But it's quite run down. Jean Tate said it was there'd been bomb damage and quite a lot of refugees, families, Jewish refugees living around there. So it wasn't always a sort of super millionaire row that we know now.
So getting into the 70s, and this is where I became aware of Malcolm Hulke's writing through his television Doctor Who, the first one being Doctor Who and the Silurians. And you do notice, if you look through those 5 years that he wrote for the show, every story has got something to do with reptiles or lizards. So did he have a particular fascination with reptiles?
No, not particularly. That's not I'm aware of anyway, but maybe they just found that it kind of worked. I was looking for... I suppose you wanted an alien that wasn't a robot, so... and wasn't horrific, so they are distinctly a different race, but they're not monsters in that sense, are they? They're not meant to be frightening. Well, they can be frightening, but more frightening for what they do rather than the way they look.
And as a kid, I was fascinated with dinosaurs, and my son is still fascinated with dinosaurs.
Yeah,
so I think it's pretty timeless.
I'm always still puzzled by that. What is it about dinosaurs that were pretty violent, aggressive monsters? Why they become such cuddly things for children?
Maybe, well, particularly when they're brought to life on things like Jurassic World, and maybe not so much Invasion of the Dinosaurs, but I still found Invasion of the Dinosaurs quite scary, despite the special effects. It was the sound effects of those dinosaurs that I always remember more than anything.
Yeah.
But Doctor Who and the Silurians is a very, very interesting story, because Terrance Dicks would always say there's only a couple of different stories you can have: alien invasion or mad scientist, and Doctor Who and the Silurians was neither.
No, it's like saying, I think either one of them, they both said more or less the same thing, that it's always like we go to them or they come to us, but we'll suppose they have been here all the time. So it's quite a neat, clever idea, I think, that this ancient race has predated humans, and really it's their planet, and they regard us as the annoying little furry animals who somehow grabbed the planet from them, and they want it back.
Mm. Now, there are quite marked differences in the TV episodes compared to the novelization, and you and I have been listening to the audio book reading by Carol and John, which was fascinating. It's been years since I've read the book or listened to the audio. And what were your impressions of that, giving that a listen as a change from watching the TV episodes?
I really enjoyed it. I've always been a big fan of Caroline on Doctor Who. It's a real shame that she only did one season, but we're lucky to have those full serials. So she's kind of this clever, cool, sophisticated, intellectual woman. And I think her reading of it is very good, and brings out some of the...
It was interesting getting her take on the different voices as opposed to the voices I remember from the TV episodes, because they're quite different, lots of them.
Yeah, she's a very good actress, and she was classically trained and worked for the National Theatre, I think, or RSC. So Doctor Who was a bit of a sort of departure in her career. I've seen her in a number of other TV series. But this is the one that sort of people remember, I suppose.
I think it certainly does for me.
As an audio version, I think it was very good. I mean, she's quite a good reader, and she does the voices very well. They've obviously enhanced the Silurians ones. But yeah, it's definitely worth listening.
So I noticed they didn't refer to Silurians once in the whole book. So that's Malcolm correcting himself. He'd already corrected himself in the Sea Devils when he said, "Well, technically they should be called Eocenes, not
that's right,
not Silurians."
Isn't the past?
And I'd forgotten that he'd corrected himself in the book.
Well, there is one little reference, which is the password to get into Wenley Moor is Silurians, isn't it?
I missed that.
When the Doctor and Liz first arrive, and they're let in. But beyond that, I don't think you're right. I think that's a really interesting take. I think something he said was they did an interview with Gary Hopkins, and he said you have to make changes with the television script. You get lots of toing and froing. Remember, in a story, you really have two stories going on at once: the good guys and the bad guys. In television, you don't do very long scenes because people get bored. But in a book, this would be very annoying if you got a half-page chapter and then another half-page chapter. So in television, you write it like this, and in a book, you write like this, and so you can go back in time. So another reasons he says is that when you're writing, you realise I can make that a bit better. You feel you can, and therefore you should. So it does add. I mean, in the beginning of the Silurians, there's a whole prequel, I suppose you would call it nowadays, where it shows these Silurians, as I'm probably going to continue to call them, going into the shelters, and they're kind of looking up at what we know to be the moon, and they're looking at the little furry animals, and they're expecting to just be in these shelters a brief time, but in fact, turn out to be 100 million years, I think. And the Silurians have been given names like Morka and Cato and Ogdell. So he kind of, I was going to say he humanizes them, but maybe he reptilizes them. I don't know. You become.
I struggled with Cato. I kept thinking of the Pink Panther.
Right.
But,
so it's kind
but
of
I could visualize each of them from the TV series very, very easily. You know, the older one, the younger one that was cranky, and the scientist. So they were the three in that. Interesting.
He said you must expunge from your mind the possibility that they may have seen it, the audience may have seen it. So you've got to describe things, but also the role of people, and you've got to try and get all this in at the beginning without boring. So he assumes that people haven't seen the TV book, because don't forget, in the 70s there were
no repeats. Yep. Yeah. So it was okay. It was totally okay to do that back then. Whereas it's very different to Terrence Dicks, though, because he did do some really good books and had great style, but he would often go straight in some of the shorter books. It goes straight from the script into the book, and that's what it felt like. Whereas Malcolm Hulke's books were never like that. They were always much more packed outwards with more detail. I like the relationship between Dr. Quinn and Miss Dawson. I think her name, he even named her in the book, was her name Phyllis? Is that who it was? And she's hoping Dr. Quinn would call her Phyllis. Like there's this like unrequited love story in there as well. And there's a scene that is put in the book. She's actually there when Dr. Quinn gets killed by the Silurian, and she basically begs for her life of the Silurian. I thought that was really interesting, because in the TV show there's nothing at all. And it's a really good addition that doesn't take away from the story at all.
"What is it?" said Miss Dawson. "It's breaking out," he said, and seemed unable to move from where he was standing. Miss Dawson rushed over to the door. The hall was full of smoke. Through the smoke, she could see the door to the store cupboard glowing red with heat. Suddenly, the door completely disintegrated into a mound of brilliantly red ashes, and the reptile man stepped through into the hall. The third eye in its forehead was glowing as brilliantly as the embers at its feet. "I'm going to help you," Dr. Quinn said. "I was going to bring you food and water and take you back to your people." Dr. Quinn's words ended in a strangled scream as the reptile man turned to face him. The third eye glowed a more brilliant red for a few seconds, and Dr. Quinn crumpled to the floor and was silent. "Please," said Miss Dawson, "please don't kill me. I mean you no harm. I want to live. Oh, don't kill me, please." The glow of the third eye subsided.
"You're intruders on our planet," said the reptile man. "You will all die eventually."
He walked slowly across the hall, one arm raised. Miss Dawson nerved herself for the blow. The palm of the reptile hand hit her across the side of her face, and she fell unconscious on top of Dr. Quinn.
She gets a whole backstory about having been living with her mother and being frustrated, and she can't sort of escape her mother, but eventually she does, and then she meets Quinn, falls in love, but he just wants her to be her friend and so on. So so there's much more about her than she's only a minor character, really. It doesn't have that many scenes in the TV version. And again,
he was a much more nasty character, Dr. Quinn, in the book than the sort of mild-mannered Fulton Mackay in the TV series. So it was a very different take on that character.
Yeah, in Major Barker, or Baker as he is in the TV version, the security officer, Wendley Moore, made much more of what we would call over here a Colonel Blimp character, kind of obsessed with saboteurs, communists, fascists, even the Americans, who he thinks are going to conspiring against the centre. And he's giving a backstory as well about having been in the army and shot somebody accidentally or deliberately, I don't know which. But everyone
he had a PTSD, didn't he?
Yeah, something like that. So
from his experience,
he's got a much more sort of, it's almost like playing a kind of role, when he's captured by the Silurian, he cries, "I die for England and St. George."
Yeah,
it seems very topical, actually. So perhaps he's imagining he's in a kind of, Henry V or something like that.
But it's interesting, right at the end, there's a whole section that's cut. I don't know if you got to the end, Michael, but the section where the Doctor goes back down to the caves and then the Brigadier has to come and rescue him because he gets attacked by Morka. No, is it Morka? Yeah, Morka. That's completely gone from the book. Right. The book finishes kind of very quickly. Maybe he had a page count limit that he had to cut something out, and that was something.
The books are always a set length, apparently for ease of packaging them up. So there sort of had to be a certain thinness or width, so they could be put into things. Right at the end, I think Mac implies, unlike the TV version, that Liz knew that the Brigadier was going to blow up the Silurians.
Yeah, very explicitly. Yep.
Give her a line that he had to. They'd never have accepted sharing this world. Whereas in the TV version, it seems to be a surprise to her. Also, the
Yeah, he
relationship
says, "What,
between
you knew?" And she said, "No, of course I didn't."
the
Yeah.
relationship between Liz and the Doctor is much more kind of fractured. She's really irritated by the Doctor. He comes across as much more kind of overbearing and insensitive and condescending and patrician in the book, and she's constantly sort of on the verge of screaming with frustration.
Yeah, because you're much more inside her head in the book
Yeah,
than you are on the TV screen.
there's a
So,
whole thing about when they're
um,
going to Wembley Moor, and she sort of researched the map and knows exactly where they're going, but he insists on reading the map too, and she's kind of driven to the point of madness by him. So that's quite funny, I think. Like it's
mm,
showing they kind of almost rewritten the character of the Doctor to make him even more sort of overbearing and patrician than he is in the TV version.
mm. Yeah, so I would highly recommend this to anyone that wants to experience the story in a different way. Are there any other novels that he wrote for his stories, and The Green Death, of course, he wrote that one too, that you recall as standouts? I think you might have mentioned Colony in Space was one.
Yes, I think it's probably his best work actually because there's so much
Okay.
more in it. All sorts of backstories for everybody about the colonists, the kind of world, the two colonists who get killed early on. You just about meet them. Oh, they're dead. Whereas in the novel, there's a whole passage about how they're living and want to get off the earth, and they meet the colonists and go into space, and then all the problems they have in the early year or the early months of the colony. So and also the leader of the IMC, Dent, played very brilliantly by Maurice Parry, I think, in the TV version. He's given a whole backstory about working for IMC, the company man, and you get a company wife. The computer links him with a woman, and they stay for their two records together, and that means they're married. And he comes home
Oh
from a
wow.
flight. There's a woman and a house waiting for him. So it's very much like
Okay.
the what's that book by, I can't remember the name. An American guy wrote a book called The Organization Man, I think, in the 50s. So I think it's very much based on that you work for a company, Japanese perhaps as well. That you work for a company and the company looks after you, but you don't have to
Okay.
question the company. So yeah, I think it's a
Another
brilliant.
complex story too. So very complex. You've got the colonists who are getting evicted by IMC, and then you've got the natives who are there getting exploited as well, who want to try and fight back, and then you've got the added element of the master he's thrown in there as well. I think that was done beautifully. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I love all his work, so it's hard for me to say which is my favorite. But I love Colony in Space, and the book has a much better title. I know that much. The
Yeah.
Doomsday Weapon.
Yes, I think if you're looking for sort of some political message, then it's a lot about. I mean, the reason why there's the civilization on I can't remember the name of the planet now, but on the colony's planet has degraded is because of this weapon, and it's kind of poisoned the world and poisoned their civilization. So there's a small kind of priest caste, but then the rest of the native population is degenerated. So it's about sort of the
I
dangers.
think it's called Exarius.
That's
Is that
right,
what it's
yeah.
called?
Yeah.
Yep.
And so it's about sort of the dangers of nuclear weapons, really, isn't it? I think sort of all the dangers of radiation, but also dangers of having a weapon which is so destructive you can't actually use it, or if you did, it would destroy yourselves as well as everybody else. So there is a sort of subterranean political message in it, but it's not overt, is it? It's more about about making a story that's kind of interesting. I suppose again the IMC are represented as kind of capitalist company with no redeeming. But again, you get conflict within the IMC, don't you? So the mining engineer played by Gordon Kay sort of turns against it in the end and helps the colonists. So it's more
It
a
does.
subtle kind of story than you might think.
And then in the Sea Devils, you've got someone who, in the prison governor, who's in it for himself too, for greedy gain.
Yeah.
Although he did have a patriotic reason too, because the master had
Yeah,
talked him into doing it patriotically as well.
yeah, it's painted in quite a sympathetic way, really. I mean, sort of showed us sort of misled by the master, but who isn't, but for the best of reasons, perhaps, or for understandable reasons. So
Yeah.
to kind of again, sort of, I think there's something about he being a governor of a colony which had been instantly almost sort of then freed itself from him. It's shown us really as a kind of failure. This is his last chance at success. So yeah, again, it's kind of a subtle story, not sort of necessarily black and white, more greys. I've got a lot of
Mm,
greys in Mac's stories, I think, really. As I say, apart from the
absolutely.
war games with the aliens, there's no redeeming qualities with the aliens in the war games. They are really completely nasty, vicious, impervious to
Pretty
the
one-dimensional.
yeah. Very much again about, like, I suppose, how perhaps Mac viewed the generals in the First World War or other wars, really. You know, we have an attack, we've gained half a mile, we've lost 20,000 men. Oh, well, it was worth it then.
Speaking of generals, there was a character who was very nasty, who was a general in the Frontier in Space, but then by the end of the story turned around and kind of saw the error of his ways, and
Oh, yeah, William.
Hulk gave him the opportunity to come good. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, he's
yeah,
eventually convinced. And he also convinces the Draconians as well. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
they're a really interesting sort of alien race, aren't they? Quite noble and yeah. So I'm surprised they haven't brought them back, really, but perhaps that was they felt that they couldn't bring them back without an interesting story. Actually,
Yeah.
if you're listening, RTD, I didn't say that. Don't bring them back.
I don't know. Maybe the Draconians, dragons, maybe with their
Yeah,
sort of their basis on samurais,
yes.
Japanese culture. Perhaps that's seen as a bit too. I know. I
Mm,
mean, all the Egyptology was recently removed from the Sutek story, so perhaps that would have to be removed too if
yeah.
it was brought back now. I don't know, but it
Okay.
would be a shame if it was, because it makes for a wonderful, wonderful story.
Yeah.
And Invasion of the Dinosaurs. That's the last one that he did. I want to ask you why that was the last one he did in a second, but the story itself, I've always loved that story. Once again, full of complex characters. You've got the minister
Mm,
Grover, who's putting on a front and pretending to be someone. You got another general in
mm,
there who's not who he seems, and you've got Mike Yates who's being pulled along as well, and very, very, yeah, you're right. He writes a lot of grey.
mm.
Nothing's black and white in any of his stories,
Yeah,
and I really love that about his stories.
yeah, it's probably showing people or what he considers to be, he kind of says, well, with that kind of key moment when Mike Yates holds the Brigadier and the Doctor up at gunpoint, and the Doctor is saying, well, your methods are wrong. I agree with what you're trying to achieve, but this won't work. And so it's about good people picking the wrong road, really. And also the
Yeah.
illusion that somehow the past is better, which again bedevils us, I think, as a society. People always think, well, 40 years ago things were really good, and when you live through an era, you think, well, actually, they weren't that brilliant. There was good bits about it, but also bad bits. So beware of the illusion that somehow the past was better, and all you got to do. Well, it has become very powerful. I mean, in some sense, the Nazis was a sort of gigantic movement to try and recast Germany and push it back into the past, into this kind of illusory world where Germany dominated and the modern society could be pushed away with all its
Mm,
complexity, and you have a sort of much simpler society.
mm. So that brings me to the question: why was that the last time he
Mhm.
wrote for
Well,
Doctor Who? Was it because Terence left, or
yeah, I
and
think
Robert Holmes wasn't interested, or?
Barry Letts and Terence Dix moved on, because after working very hard for 4 or 5 years, then you want to do something else if you're a creative person, rather than just redo the same thing over and over again. And so there's other new people running Doctor Who, and he wasn't asked to write for it. So, and not like the other series that he worked for, like the Avengers had come to an end. Not Danger Man, which
Yeah,
we wrote for, had come to an end. So,
I did Danger Man too. Okay.
yeah, he did one episode of Danger Man, which is very interesting, which I recommend. Again, but often he tries to challenge, the sort of east-west binary in his story, the Soviets. So in the Stage Man episode, as an aside, he teams up with the very good-looking KGB operative, the woman, I mean, and they sort of fighting a common enemy. So, which is similar to what happens in one of his Avengers episodes, Concerto, where he teams up with a KGB guy to protect a Russian pianist from people trying to disrupt his tour. So again, it's very sort of challenging. So I think going back to what you asked, I think he then also realised that you could make more money writing books. So he produced the Doctor Who books. He also wrote 4 novels for a popular British soap series called Crossroads, which, though often derided,
Yep.
was very popular with the public. And so these sold in huge quantities. So he's making more money out of his novels than he'd been making out of TV. And also easier, I think, because with television, you sort of have endless meetings, you reduce a script outline, then you write the script, and then they say, can you change this? And you do that, they say, can you change that? Oh, we've lost this actor, got no budget, can you write this out? So there's a lot of work involved in producing a television script. Whereas with the novels, you get the feeling you wrote them, took them to the publishers, and they went, great, we'll put them out next week.
There was one thing I wanted to ask you a little earlier, because chronologically it was earlier, but did Mac write a radio version of Doctor Who starring Peter Cushing?
Yes, yeah, they did. Yeah, so it was in the mid-60s. There was a sort of idea of doing a radio version, and he did write a script, and he did apparently record a sort of pilot episode with Peter Cushing, who played the Doctor clearly in a couple of film versions. So it was a kind of rewriting and partly of the first, unearthly child. So it's kind of based on that, but with some differences. The Doctor's living
Gotcha.
with the TARDIS and Susan on a heath somewhere, so it's more like a bit akin to the David Whittaker version of how the Doctor first appears. But it didn't go beyond the pilot episode, which has been wiped, so the script, I think, has survived. And there's an interesting
It has.
account of it in a Doctor Who magazine. I've forgotten which one it was now. It might be Nothing at the End of the Lane, where they go into the whole story of it. So I have included that in my book, but I've not seen the actual script. I relied upon the research done by somebody else, but it didn't go any further anyway.
Nothing at the End of the Lane. That's is that Richard Bignell?
I think so, yes. There's also Vorp magazine, who do a lot of interesting Doctor Who stuff, which I recommend if you've not seen it.
Okay.
Yeah, they did
cool.
In their last episode, they did a sort of animated version of that meeting from the beginning of the David Whittaker book, where Ian is driving across Barnes Common, I think it is, and meets Barbara and the Doctor. So it does completely change the story of how the Doctor first meets Ian and Barbara. And so they did
That's right. Stephen Noonan voiced that too, didn't he?
Yeah.
I stopped the car at last and let the fog close in around me. I knew I was somewhere on Barnes Common, and I had a suspicious idea it was the most deserted part as well.
Help! I'm Barbara. Barbara Wright. Susan was in the road.
Oh my goodness. I say, you there! Are you trying to get us all killed? There's petrol everywhere!
What are you doing here?
They did an animated version of it, which is very good, actually. Very.
I haven't seen that yet. I must see if I can track it down. Now, Mac wrote what I've seen referred to as the Writing for Television Bible. Now, that was towards the end of his life that he put that book together, was it?
Mid-70s, Dwayne. So around about. The first came out in 75, 76, I think. I've got a copy. So it's again part of,
Yep.
I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about how he wrote a pamphlet for Unity Theatre about explaining how Unity Theatre worked. And this is very much in this vein about, but it's quite lengthy, but explains in enormous detail about how television works, how scripts work, the role of producers, directors, all the things you need to know if you're interested in writing for television. So he's trying to explain the craft, really, to try and demystify it and say to people, well, if you're interested, this is how you can go about it. So Andrew Cartmel told me that he sort of found it very useful when he was script editor on Doctor Who. And there were a couple of people I come across mentioned the people who were inspired by it to actually write scripts for television. And he also ran a writing school for television. So people would sort of work on scripts and send them to him, I think. So it's all part of demystification, I think, explaining the craft. And sort of, I think it was quite conscious of people sort of becoming writers and putting the drawbridge up, whereas his was a reverse approach. I also went out speaking to writers groups as well. So I've come across references to him speaking around the country and organising conferences for writers as well. So he's very much into the idea of writing as a craft. It should be well paid and respected, but it shouldn't be exclusionary. It should invite people to join, really, if you're good at it.
Yeah.
Obviously, he wrote The Making of Doctor Who as well, along with Terence Dicks, which again, was so sort of awash with Doctor Who material now, Doctor Who books and blogs and websites and wonderful programs such as yourselves. But in the 70s, there was none of that. So people had no idea, really, because there was no way of finding out. So it's a very interesting book about...
That covered the Sea Devils, didn't it?
Yes, in the first version, yes. And Robot in this. So there's two versions, one Mac wrote and then one Terence wrote. I mean, they're both credited, but Mac was responsible for the first version with the Sea Devils. And also he spent quite a bit of time talking to Sidney Newman and other people about, because obviously it's been 10 or 12 years since Doctor Who had started. So there was no record particularly of how the programme, so he spent time talking to people about how the programme actually evolved and what their memories were. Because obviously television is a hugely busy business, so once you've made something or created something, you then move on. So a few years later, people come along and say, how did that come about? You're going, oh, I can't remember. You should talk to so-and-so. They've got a better memory. So it's a very, very interesting book, I think. It explained, again, how TV works and how TV is made, which would have been very useful, I suppose, if you knew nothing about it.
He died pretty young.
Yes, he did, very sadly, in 1979. He was born in 1924, died in 1979. Caught cancer and died in July 79. So, I mean...
So he's only 54. Very young.
I know. Well, this is an era where people smoked all the time. I mean, I remember, people smoked at home, at work, in the cinema, in the pub, in the cafe, in university lecturers. So that may be what he suffers from. Or maybe something else, I don't know. But we lost him very early. Also, before fandom became massive. So there are a few interviews with Mac. I mean, a number of people, young men, they all seem to be young men, teenagers even, went to visit him in Hampstead in the sort of mid-70s, late 70s, before his death, and interviewed him and for their fanzine. So there's a developing world of fanzines from the mid-70s onwards, which is chronicled in an excellent Telos book quite recently, which I recommend. And so there are surviving interviews with him where he explores. And there is one recorded interview with him which Gary Hopkins did. So that's
what I was going to ask. Just the one recording.
Yes. So Gary was living in South Wales and wrote to Mac. And Mac wrote back and said, well, why don't you come up and see me? So he arrived and then realised Mac was quite ill. This is March 79.
Right.
They spent a couple of hours together, so Gary taped it. But you can hear Mac getting a bit tired towards the end. They keep saying, oh, what have we done yet? I'm feeling very hungry. It was looked after by a friend, Dr. Catherine Dale, but I've never been able to track her down, sadly.
Right.
But so that's the only interview with him. There's no video of him There's pictures, but no recording other than Gary Hopkins' interview, which he kindly shared with me.
Is that the same Gary Hopkins who's done a Big Finish or two? Could be.
Not sure. I'm not sure. I didn't know he'd done Big Finish. Might well have done. He was very involved in Doctor Who fandom. He also wanted to be. I mean, one of the reasons why I contacted Mac was a certain amount of self-interest, which is fine. He wanted to become a writer, so he wanted to sort of get to know a bit about writing or meet writers. And it worked for Gary. He went on to have a career in writing. He wrote for. There was a series of Sherlock Holmes that Granada made over here in the 80s and 90s, starring Jeremy Brett, which is an excellent version of the best, actually, I think, of Sherlock Holmes. And Gary wrote some episodes of that, and some other things as well. We'll have to check with Big Finish. I didn't know that.
Yeah, there is one that I definitely know the name of. It's called The Last.
Oh, right.
It's an Eighth Doctor adventure.
Oh, right.
But it's the only one I can think of. There may be one more. So as a historian and someone who's looked closely at the life of Malcolm Hulke, what would you say is his main legacy that he's left us?
I think writing good stories, stories that catch your attention, that aren't simple, that are complex, have often complex characters. They aren't black and white characters generally. The stories aren't black and white. It isn't good versus bad. It's kind of partly good against partly bad, as life often is. So, I mean, his sort of desire was to tell stories that worked for the viewer or the reader, and that writing was a craft which should be respected and valued, and not just sort of seen as a bunch of words on paper.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing some of your thoughts on that. We're looking forward to the release of the book that's coming out towards in the second half of 25, you reckon? So, we'll look forward to that.
Yeah.
And what was the name of it again?
It's called Don't Believe Everything You Say. The Life and Writing of Malcolm Hulke. Although that may change, but that's the title at the moment, which I quite like. So it's been a pleasure being on your show, Dwayne, and
thanks very much for coming on. It's a fascinating character that's usually just a name in my head. It's nice to be able to get to know him as a person through you, and I'm looking forward to the book too.
Yeah, as an interesting human being, I think, who was left an effect on people who knew him and remembered him. Luckily for me, as a writer.
Very good. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Cheers.
This has been the Sirens of Audio, the incredible Hulke, with our guest Michael Herbert and your host Dwayne Bunny. Theme music by Joe Kramer. Check out our live event details and all other info on the podcast at sirensofaudio.com. Got some feedback? Drop a comment below or send your emails to sirensofaudio@gmail.com, or you can DM us at any of our socials. Our handle is @AudioSirens. Thanks for listening, audiophiles. We'll hear you next time.